If you can fix it in 10 minutes, I'll admit I was wrong, publicly. But if you fail, this door closes forever. Professor Hale, MIT, March 2025. But that comes later. Today, Elena just stood in front of room B 231, holding a special admission letter in her trembling hand. She was small, thin, wearing a faded gray janitor's jacket, her brown hair tied back with an old rubber band. Her hands were calloused, her eyes were tired. The red seal at the top of the letter was real. It came from MIT's Academic Exceptions Committee, signed by the Vice Provost himself. A sharp voice broke the silence from inside the lecture hall. "This class is not for janitors' daughters." Nobody laughed out loud, but some smirked. Others turned to see who would dare enter Professor Hale's sacred domain wearing work boots. Elena didn't speak. She didn't shrink. She didn't apologize. She simply walked forward, her footsteps marking an invisible line between herself and everyone else in that room. She chose the last row, sat down, opened a battered notebook with yellowed pages, the kind sold for 99 cents at gas stations. Under the cold, flickering light of the ceiling, she whispered to herself, "Thermodynamics is beautiful." No one heard her, but some would remember. Professor Hale was a living legend at MIT, a towering figure in thermal systems and jet propulsion. Silver hair, tailored vest, and a voice like steel. He didn't tolerate mediocrity or sentimentality. Today's lecture: Carnot efficiency and real-world irreversibility. He scribbled on the board with sharp, quick strokes. If you think real engines can achieve theoretical maximums, you may leave now. Real life is not a textbook. The chalk screeched across the blackboard as he wrote, "Efficiency equals sign 1, TCth." Elena copied it down carefully. She didn't need to. She had known it since she was 12, but copying felt like respect. Two students near the front row whispered, "She used to clean the labs. Her dad's on the maintenance crew." "Probably just a PR stunt. She won't last a semester." Elena heard, but she had long learned to separate signal from noise. Their words were like rust in an old pipe, sharp, irritating, but irrelevant. Then it happened. A faint, almost imperceptible whine, like a breath caught in metal. Elena paused. At the far corner of the lab sat a turbine engine, covered in a dust-stained plastic sheet. A GET 700 cutaway model. 4 months ago, a senior project had overloaded it. It shut down and was never touched again. Most students called it the expensive corpse, but not Elena. To her, that sound wasn't death. It was breath. After class, as the others rushed out to lunch and internships, Elena stayed. She walked over to the turbine, sat beside it, listened. She didn't touch it, just closed her eyes. Metal fatigue? No, not yet. The engine was whispering, but not everyone was built to hear it. Then a voice cut through the silence. "I don't know what you're doing, but that's not part of your cleaning job." Professor Hale stood at the doorway, his gaze colder than the Boston wind. "That machine costs more than most students' homes. It's broken. It's staying that way." Elena stood slowly, her eyes still fixed on the engine. "It's not broken. Just stuck, like a breath caught in the throat." Hale raised an eyebrow. He didn't know whether to be insulted or intrigued. "Name?" "Elena Granger." "Related to Thomas Granger?" "He's my father." That gave him pause. Thomas Granger, former aerospace systems engineer. Brilliant. Once. Now reduced to wrenching pipes and fixing leaky vents. Hale turned away. "Be careful. Engineering isn't poetry. Feelings don't fix engines. I'm not guessing, Elena said softly. I'm listening. That night, Elena returned to the basement room she and her father rented. One table, one lamp, one life. Thomas Granger sat with grease-stained hands and tired eyes. He didn't ask how class went, just placed a bowl of bean stew on the table and said, "Did you know turbines have heartbeats?" Elena smiled. She did. Machines don't lie, but they don't shout either. They whisper. You gotta listen hard. She didn't reply, just quietly turned the page in her notebook. Next morning, Professor Hale posed a question to the class. Why isn't helium used in the Otto cycle? Silence. Even the best students froze. Then, a voice from the back. Because helium's gamma value is high. That means during compression, temperature rises too fast. Pre-ignition risk becomes unacceptable. Heads turned. Elena didn't look up. She wasn't performing. She was just telling the truth. Hale stared, measured, then said a single word. Correct. One word. But it cracked the ice. A few students whispered her name now, not mockingly, curiously. A boy named Toby looked back from the middle row. A quiet nod. No smile. Just recognition. That evening, Elena sat under a single bulb and opened her notebook to a blank page. She wrote in small, steady letters, "The engine still breathes." Then turned off the light. And in the quiet, the girl who once mopped the floors of MIT began her walk toward legend. The turbine wasn't the only thing that had begun to stir. By the next morning, word had spread. Not loudly, MIT students didn't gossip like teenagers, but whispers traveled fast between lecture halls and library tables. She answered a grad-level question. Cold. No notes. Professor Hale said she was right. Wait, the janitor's daughter? Most didn't say her name. They just said her. Inside Lecture Hall B231, nothing had changed on the surface. Same flickering fluorescent lights, same faded posters of Brayton and Rankine cycles, same cold gray turbine in the corner, still hidden under its plastic cover. But something was different. Elena felt it. Not in words, not in stares, but in the way people turned pages more carefully, in how some stopped whispering when she entered. She sat down at her usual seat, back row, near the vent, and opened her notebook. Her pencil was nearly worn flat. She had no replacement. Professor Hale entered the room at exactly 8 a.m. as always. No small talk, no greeting, just precision. Today, we begin practical loss analysis in Brayton systems. He tapped a button on the remote. Equations filled the screen. Isentropic efficiency, pressure ratio losses, real-world turbine maps. No one looked at the turbine, except her. When break time came, most students filed out to the hallway or gathered in corners to discuss internships and summer labs. Elena stayed. She walked toward the turbine, pulled back the dusty cover slightly, and laid her hand on the outer casing. Closed her eyes. She wasn't touching a machine. She was listening. The vibration was back, faint, rhythmic, more distinct than before, like a heart that refused to stop beating. She tilted her head. There it was again. Tap, tap, pause, tap. She placed her fingers lower, near the coolant manifold. It wasn't random. It was trying to say something. Then a voice cut through the quiet like a scalpel. "What are you doing?" Dina Marshall. Elena turned slowly. Dina stood with arms crossed, holding a thick notebook pressed to her chest. Her tone wasn't angry. It was amused, a kind of polished mockery. "Trying to talk to it, or pretending you know what it's saying?" Elena replied softly. "Engines don't talk, but they do leave trails, if you listen closely." Dina raised an eyebrow. "Right. I suppose the pipes also sing lullabies to you at night?" Elena didn't answer. Dina stepped closer to the turbine. "You think this machine listens to feelings? That it's going to whisper the answer just because you close your eyes?" Still no response. So Dina gave her the final push. "Try touching it while it's running. Let's see if your fingers can back up that poetic little brain." A pause. Elena didn't move. "Or maybe," Dina continued, "you're only good at talking from the back row." Before either of them could speak again, a deep voice came from the doorway. "Do not damage the casing." Professor Hale had returned without a sound. His arms were crossed, his gaze locked on Elena. "That turbine costs more than your entire apartment block," he said flatly. "If you leave so much as a scratch, you won't set foot in this lab again." Elena let her hand fall. She looked him in the eye. "Then I won't scratch it." Hale stepped into the room, ignoring Dina completely. He walked to the front of the class and dropped a clipboard on the desk. "Next week, the turbine will be live. I'm accepting diagnostic submissions." He looked at both girls now. "If you can identify the fault correctly, you'll be allowed hands-on access. Fail, and the door closes." Dina smirked. Elena said nothing. Later that afternoon, in the library, Toby found her sitting alone at a corner table, surrounded by scattered diagrams and a page full of scribbled loops. He sat down without asking. "You were right," he said. She looked up, confused. "About the cavitation. I pulled up the maintenance logs from when that turbine first shut down. They noted unexplained heat spikes in the bypass lines exactly where you placed your hand." Elena nodded, but didn't smile. She turned her notebook toward him. On it was a diagram, hand-drawn, of the T-700's cooling system, labeled from memory. Toby blinked. "You drew that from memory?" Elena shrugged. "Saw the real thing once, 3 months ago. Night shift." He stared at the page, then at her. "You're not just some girl who got lucky, are you?" Elena gently closed the notebook. "No one gets lucky in this room." That night, back at the basement apartment, her father placed 2 sandwiches on the table. He didn't ask how her day was, just said, "Still listening to engines?" She nodded. "One of them talked back today." He looked at her. "And the others?" She paused. "One laughed." Her father sat down slowly, thought for a moment. "Machines whisper, people shout. You gotta learn to listen through both." At 11:41 p.m., Elena opened her notebook one last time. She drew the coolant manifold again, slower this time, with a shaded area near the left auxiliary valve. She labeled it with a pencil. "Suspected microfracture. Test with pressure dye." Then turned the page and wrote in quiet, careful print, "Not all rivals are enemies. Some are just trying not to drown, too." By Friday, the tension in room B-231 wasn't subtle anymore. It was thick, pressurized, like a sealed vessel seconds before rupture. The names were circulating now, not just her. Elena Granger. Some still said it with disdain, some with disbelief, and a few, quietly, with respect. Dina sat in the front row, posture perfect. A fresh diagram of the turbine on her tablet, annotated in 3 colors. She'd submitted her diagnostic report on time. Of course, 10 pages with citations. Elena had turned in 5, handwritten, on graph paper. No one knew what Professor Hale thought of either. He didn't speak as he entered. He just wrote one question on the board, in large block letters. Why is helium unsuitable for Otto-cycle combustion engines? Pens stopped. Eyes went wide. It wasn't on the syllabus. It wasn't in the prep reading. It was a test. No one answered. Not Dina, not the PhD student in the corner, not even Toby, who usually had something to say. But from the back row, a voice rose, quiet but clear. Because helium has a high gamma value. Heads turned. Again. Elena didn't stand. She didn't raise her voice. She simply explained. Gamma, Cp over Cv, is higher for helium because it's a monatomic gas. That causes a faster temperature rise during the compression stroke. Too fast. The result is pre-ignition, detonation. Otto-cycle engines can't handle that. The system fails. Silence. Only the faint hum of the projector remained. Professor Hale turned. He stared at her, long enough for a few students to glance at each other, unsure whether to cringe or clap. Then he spoke. Repeat it. Elena looked up. She met his eyes without flinching. High gamma leads to rapid thermal rise. That causes early ignition in the combustion chamber. Otto-cycle systems can't regulate it fast enough. Engine damage follows. Hale set down his marker and nodded. Correct. No applause. But something shifted. In a room like this, silence wasn't failure. It was acknowledgement. And that, at MIT, was louder than any cheer. Toby turned. This time, he smiled. Just a little. Even Dinah blinked. After class, Professor Hale stopped Elena near the door. Granger. Yes, sir? Where did you learn that? She answered simply. I read papers. Then I tried to feel what they meant. He raised an eyebrow. Feel. She paused, searching for the right words. Some engines explode. Others just whisper before they fail. I'm trying to hear the whisper. He didn't smile, but something behind his eyes softened. Follow me. His office was a long walk from the lecture hall, the walls lined with blueprints, plaques, models of engines from every decade of aerospace history. Elena followed in silence. On one shelf, dusty and half-hidden, sat a framed black-and-white photo of a younger man, oil-stained overalls, wrench in hand, beside a test engine. Thomas Granger. She didn't mention it. Professor Hale sat, poured a cup of coffee, didn't offer one. You're not a student in my class, not officially. No, sir. But you've submitted a diagnostic report. You've answered graduate-level questions. You've handled yourself under pressure. He looked directly at her now. Why are you really here? Elena answered without hesitation. Because I want to build something that listens, not just runs. He stared at her. That turbine isn't a metaphor. It's $3.2 million of real metal. It doesn't care about your feelings. Elena nodded. But it still breathes. That night, back in the basement apartment, she didn't eat dinner. She just stared at her notebook, the one with oil smudges and creased corners. She turned to the next page and began sketching something new. Not just a repair, a redesign. At the top of the page, in small, firm letters, she wrote, "Next time, I won't just answer. I'll change the question." After Elena answered the helium question, the whispers didn't stop. They sharpened. By Monday, her name had moved from quiet corners to front-row conversations. People asked where she came from, what her GPA was, who sponsored her. No one had answers, and that made her even more noticeable. In the world of MIT, mystery wasn't charm. It was danger. Dina Marshall watched it all unfold with a calm, analytical distance, the kind of gaze that had measured and mastered everything in her life since age 5. Her parents weren't just donors to MIT's aerospace lab. They built it. She wasn't just top of the class. She was expected to be. And now someone had entered the room without a key, without invitation, and somehow was holding the board. That someone wore a faded jacket, carried a single pencil, and never spoke unless it was to fix something. Dina wasn't angry. She was interested. But interest for her was just the first stage of strategy. At 8:01 a.m., Professor Hale began class with his usual cadence. Engine live diagnostics begin next week. You'll work in pairs. Reports due Friday. Gasps. Some groaned. Others whispered. He looked up. Unless someone wants to try it alone. A few glances flicked toward the back row. Elena didn't react, but Dina stood. I'll submit individually. Murmurs followed. Hale raised an eyebrow. You're that confident, Marshall? Dina smiled slightly. Confidence is a requirement, not a luxury. Then she turned, just for a moment, to meet Elena's eyes. There was no venom in her look, no mockery, just a calm, sharp curiosity. Like a surgeon before the first incision. Later that day, Elena returned to the lab to finalize her schematics. The turbine sat uncovered now, wires organized, diagnostics blinking faintly in standby mode. She stood alone for a moment, fingers resting gently near the heat exchanger. Still pulsing, still speaking. The vibration had changed, more erratic now, a different rhythm, like it was waiting for her. Then Dina stepped in, not storming, not interrupting, just there. She stopped 3 feet from Elena and spoke without preamble. You diagrammed the coolant bypass from memory. Impressive. Elena didn't look up. You read my report. Yes. A pause. Yours was wrong in 2 places. Elena turned, calmly. I expected you'd say that. Dina walked to the turbine, placed her hand on the outer casing, same spot as Elena had, days before. You think the problem is cavitation in the secondary loop. I think it's a heat-soak mismatch in the core and auxiliary conduits. Composite fatigue, not fluid error. Elena tilted her head. Then why does the pulse sound like collapsing vapor? Dina smiled. Because sometimes machines echo what we want to hear. Elena stepped forward, standing beside her now, their hands only inches apart on the turbine shell. Or maybe they echo what no one else bothered to listen for. The two stood there, silent. One from steel and legacy, one from oil and silence. Both staring at the same engine. Professor Hale watched from behind the observation glass. He said nothing, but he saw enough. 2 minds, 2 worlds, on the edge of something more dangerous than failure, understanding. That night, Elena walked home in the cold, Boston wind slicing through her thin sleeves. Her father had left soup on the table and gone back to work. Another double shift. The apartment was quiet, leaky faucet, old clock ticking, nothing more. She opened her notebook and began to write. 2 people can hear the same sound and still walk away with different truths. She turned the page, drew the turbine again. This time she added 2 paths, 2 theories, hers, and Dina's. Beneath them both, she wrote, "Only one of us will be right. But maybe, just maybe, we'll both understand something the other missed." Before Elena ever touched a turbine, she touched a wrench. Not the polished kind engineers hang on office walls, but the real kind, rusted at the edges, warm from use. Her father handed it to her when she was 8, in a garage that smelled like old rubber, motor oil, and rain. "Feel the weight," he said. "If you can't feel a tool, you can't trust it." She remembered that more clearly than her first classroom. In the present, MIT was preparing for live engine trials. Students gathered in groups, strategizing. Some treated it like war, others like theater. Elena watched in silence. She worked alone. And yet, she wasn't completely alone anymore. Because lately, Toby had started sitting closer, not beside her, just near. Like proximity was its own kind of respect. That afternoon, in the library, she unrolled a hand-drawn schematic on the table, the coolant system of the T-700, drawn from memory. Again. But this time, with a correction. A new valve she hadn't seen before. Toby leaned over. His eyebrows lifted. "That wasn't in the original file." Elena nodded. "It's not in the published version, but it was on the prototype testbed. I saw it once. Third shift 2 years ago. They were testing overflow fail-safes." He stared at her. "How do you remember all this?" She paused, then answered honestly. "I don't memorize it. I feel it. The way it vibrated under my palm. The way it clicked too loudly when the pressure built wrong." Toby blinked. "You have machine memory?" Elena tilted her head. "No, I just paid attention. Machines don't lie. People do." Flashback. Ohio, years ago. A small-town machine shop. Thomas Granger sat under an old radial engine, grease on his face. Flashlight in his mouth. Elena, 12 years old, handed him a set of pliers. "The socket's cracked," she said. "That's why the torque failed." He looked up, surprised. "How'd you know?" She shrugged. "It sounded wrong." Her father smiled. "That's how it starts." He handed her the light. "Every sound has a signature, a pattern. You'll know them like songs." She leaned in. "Then engines are like music?" "No," he said, grinning. "Music's just a prettier kind of combustion." Back at MIT, the evening light washed through the windows of the quiet lab. Elena sat cross-legged on the floor beside the turbine, notebook on her knees, head tilted. Toby joined her. No words, just two minds listening to metal. After a few minutes, he finally whispered, "Dina's theory isn't wrong." Elena nodded. "Neither is mine." "Then what happens when both are right?" She smiled, the smallest smile yet. "That's when the engine stops whispering and finally starts to speak." That night, back home, her father was already asleep. His boots were by the door. One was split at the side, duct-taped. Elena sat at the kitchen table and wrote, "The engine has more than one fault, but so does every legacy. What matters is knowing which part to forgive and which part to rebuild." She closed the notebook gently. Like a door she'd locked for years was now quietly cracking open. Dot by Thursday, the tension was no longer subtle. It was written on whiteboards. It pulsed in group chats. It echoed in the way students paused when Elena passed by. The turbine would go live tomorrow, and everyone knew who had dared to challenge it. Two names floated now, whispered in corners, scribbled in margins. Dina, Elena, Old world and unknown, legacy and labor, precision and instinct. That morning, Professor Hale entered the lecture hall 10 minutes late, an event so rare it felt like thunder without lightning. He walked to the front. No slides, no notes, just a folder in his hand. He looked around the room. Then, without expression, "Granger, front of the class." The entire room stilled. Elena stood, walked slowly to the front. Her steps were steady, but her hand still held her pencil, the same one she'd used since the first week, almost worn flat. She faced him. He looked at her, long and hard, then placed the folder on the desk beside her. "You believe you've diagnosed the turbine fault?" She nodded once. He pointed at the schematic inside the folder. "If you're right, the machine starts. If you're wrong, the turbine remains cold, and your access to this lab, to this course, ends today." Gasps. A few whispered, "He's serious." Professor Hale raised one hand to silence the noise. 10 minutes, starting now." Elena stepped forward. The lab lights above seemed colder than usual. The turbine sat waiting, metallic, massive, unmoved, like it didn't care who she was. And it didn't. Machines never do. She opened the side panel. Her fingers were gentle, but fast. She moved like someone used to cleaning behind the thing, not just reading about it. Toby watched from the back row, holding his breath. Dina didn't blink. Minute 1. Elena ran her palm across the cooling line, still warm, even powered down, a sign of residual heat, trapped, not dissipating. Minute 2. She loosened the auxiliary panel. Tiny screws, one by one. Her hands didn't shake. Minute 3, a faint hiss, steam. She paused, closed her eyes, sniffed the air. Composite, burned, slight. Minute 4, her fingers found the fracture, tiny, invisible, but tangible under pressure. The kind her father used to call truth scars. She whispered, "Found you." Minute 5, she pulled a narrow tube of thermal epoxy from her back pocket. Her father's, used on airplane brakes once. She wrapped the damaged section. Quick, clean, no extra. Minute 6, she adjusted the bypass valve, manually routed coolant around the crack. Minute 7, she stood, wiped her hands, closed the panel. Then faced Hale. "Done." He stared at her. "You still have 3 minutes." "I don't need them." He said nothing, walked past her. He checked the panel, the seal. He touched the wrap, fingered the pressure line, then turned to the board, pressed the ignition button. A low hum, a pulse. The turbine shuddered, like waking from a long sleep. A pause. Then it roared and settled into a steady, perfect rhythm, like ocean wind. Every diagnostic light turned green. Someone whispered, "No way!" Dina didn't move, but her jaw tightened, just slightly. Toby exhaled, slowly. And Professor Hale. He turned to Elena and removed his glasses, held out his hand. "I was wrong." A beat. Publicly, completely. Elena looked at his hand, then shook it. And finally, smiled. From Dina's perspective, she had seen genius before. In labs, in summer programs, at international conferences, genius came in coats, in recommendations, in white papers with perfect font. But this girl, this janitor's daughter, stood in front of a $3.2 million turbine with a half-used pencil, a roll of epoxy, and hands that hadn't stopped moving since the moment class began. And somehow, Dina couldn't look away. From Toby's perspective, he'd always thought brilliance was loud, that it announced itself. But watching Elena work was like watching someone pray, quiet, focused, not seeking permission. He could barely hear her, but he saw her lips moving, not in fear, not in panic, in rhythm, like she was listening to something deeper than pressure gauges and numbers, something that told her exactly where to look. He'd never seen hands move like that, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain. From Professor Hale's perspective, 10 minutes was generous. He expected failure in 4. He thought she'd panic at the open panel. He expected her to misdiagnose, fumble, back away. What he saw instead was muscle memory. What he heard was silence. The kind of silence only found in old machine shops, after midnight when all the apprentices had gone home and only the masters remained. When she whispered, "Found you," he felt something tighten in his chest. He hadn't heard that phrase since Ohio, 19 years ago. From a man named Thomas Granger. Back to the room. As the turbine came alive, the sound wasn't thunder. It was wind. A smooth coastal breeze, steady, unbroken, clean. Green lights flickered across the board, one by one. Like affirmation. Like absolution. Elena stepped back. Professor Hale extended his hand and said in front of 80 stunned students, "I was wrong, publicly. Completely." No one clapped, not out of disrespect, but because something sacred had just happened. And sacred things are never loud. Later that evening, as the lab emptied, Elena remained behind. Toby lingered at the doorway, unsure. She turned slightly. "You stayed." He shrugged. "I wanted to see what kind of person fixes a turbine in 7 minutes, and still waits in the dark after it's done." She smiled, but didn't turn fully. Just whispered, "The kind of person who doesn't believe it's fixed until it's silent again." He nodded and sat on the floor beside her. Not close, but closer than before. Meanwhile, Dina walked back to her dorm, alone. She took off her jacket, hung it precisely, sat at her desk, and opened Elena's 5-page handwritten diagnostic again. For the 4th time, she read every line, then circled a sentence. "Machines lie in silence until someone dares to believe the sound is still there." Dina stared at it, then whispered, not in anger, but in something like wonder, "You weren't lucky." And Professor Hale? He stood alone in his office, a photo frame in his hands, Thomas Granger, smiling, holding a wrench, wearing no lab coat. He traced the edges of the frame, then looked toward the window. The turbine in Lab 4A still hummed, still alive, and for the first time in years, so was something inside him. The lab was never truly quiet again after that day. Not because people talked more, but because the turbine was alive. It didn't roar. It breathed. A steady, even hum, like wind from the coast, miles away, echoing through a machine that had slept for too long. Every morning after, the sound was there, when lights flicked on, when students whispered, when papers rustled. It was always there now, the sound of something repaired, but not forgotten. Professor Hale stood beside it one morning, early, before class. Just him and the machine. He placed his hand near the casing, the same spot Elena had touched. He didn't expect to feel anything. But he did. A faint tremble, like a breath being held, then released. He closed his eyes. And for the first time in 2 decades, he didn't hear his own voice lecturing. He heard Thomas Granger again, laughing softly in a workshop in Ohio. Sometimes a machine won't trust you until your fingers are covered in its dust. Class that day began late, not because Hale was unprepared, but because he watched his students watching her. Elena, in her usual seat, still back row, still quiet. But something had changed. The students now made space beside her, not out of charity, out of recognition. Halfway through the lecture, he paused at the board, then turned. "Elena, come up here." She blinked, looked up. "Sir?" "You fixed it. That makes you qualified to explain it." A hush fell across the room. Elena stood, walked slowly to the front. He handed her the marker. No words, just a nod. She turned to the board, wrote cleanly, carefully. Localized overheating from composite fatigue, cavitation, thermal shock, emergency shutdown. Then turned back. "I didn't fix it alone," she said. "The machine told me where to look." A long silence. Then Hale spoke. "Some engineers wait for the screen to blink red. Others hear the whisper before the system screams." From the back of the room, Toby watched and smiled. In his hand was a folded paper, Elena's diagram. He hadn't let go of it since the trial. It was smudged now, edges torn, but it still made sense, and somehow, so did she. Dina didn't speak that day. She didn't challenge, didn't interrupt. But after class, as she packed up, she looked at Elena as she walked past and offered a nod. Just one. But from Dina Marshall, that was more than applause. It was acknowledgement. That evening, Professor Hale did something unusual. He took out a blank envelope, wrote one name on the front. Thomas Granger. Inside, he placed a printed invitation. Guest lecture, Advanced Fault Diagnostics, Lab 4A. And below that, please bring your daughter. He sealed it, placed it on the corner of his desk, and exhaled. Back in the basement apartment, Elena sat beside her father's old toolbox. She opened the lid. Slowly. Took out the very first wrench he ever gave her. Still rusted. Still hers. She turned it in her hands like a memory. Then whispered, "They don't laugh at me anymore." Her father didn't answer, just smiled. "No," he said, then added, more gently, "Now, they listen." It wasn't printed in the campus bulletin. There were no flyers, no official announcements. Just a quiet email sent by Professor Hale to all students enrolled in Advanced Thermodynamics. Guest speaker tomorrow, Lab 4A. Attendance recommended. Come with clean notes. Come willing to unlearn something. No name, no credentials, just the promise of a voice they hadn't yet heard. The next morning, Elena arrived early, earlier than usual. She sat near the front for the first time, Toby beside her, Dina one row behind. The turbine was still there, quiet now, at rest. Like it, too, was waiting. At exactly 8 a.m., the door opened, and Thomas Granger stepped into MIT. He didn't wear a blazer, just a clean shirt, the sleeves rolled up. His boots still had grease in the seams. His shoulders still bore the quiet heaviness of someone who'd carried machines across decades. He didn't clear his throat, didn't test the mic. He just walked to the front of the room and nodded to Hale, then turned to the students. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "I was asked to speak today because of something I didn't write, but something I taught." He paused, looked around the room. Some recognized him from late nights in the maintenance corridors. Most didn't. He continued. "This turbine failed, not because it was cheap or flawed. It failed because a tiny crack went unnoticed. It was whispering. But no one listened. He took a wrench from his bag, placed it on the table. It clinked, gently. This tool was mine for 26 years. It doesn't know degrees or journals, but it does know what a fracture feels like before it breaks. Silence. Not from doubt, from respect. Dina raised her hand. Sir, how did you know what was wrong? There were sensors, diagnostics, modeling. None of it found the issue. Thomas smiled kindly. Sensors listen for what they're programmed to hear. Humans, the good ones, listen for what doesn't fit the program. He looked at Elena. She lowered her gaze just slightly, then back at him, with something unspoken and whole. Toby spoke next. Sir, if you saw the problem, why didn't you say anything earlier? Thomas took a long breath. Because in this place, for a long time, people like me only speak when spoken to. He looked around, then added, but that changed when one of you listened back. Professor Hale, standing off to the side, finally stepped forward. He didn't interrupt. He placed a chair behind Thomas, gently. Then, turning to the class, said, This man taught me something this week, that expertise is not always loud, and that sometimes silence is the greatest proof of understanding. Then he did something no one expected. He sat down and let Thomas finish the lecture. What followed was not a lesson in equations. It was a lesson in attention. Thomas spoke of machines he'd repaired by feel, of aircraft brakes that hissed too soon, of turbines that hummed just slightly off-key, and how no software caught it. He passed around a fragment of carbon tubing, held it up to the light. This, he said, is where 1,000 engineers said it looks fine. But one hand, Elena's hand, felt the heat, and knew better. When the class ended, no one rushed out. They stayed seated, quiet, letting the last words settle. Then, one by one, they rose. Not to leave, to walk up to Thomas Granger. Some shook his hand. Some just said thank you. But every student did something Elena had never seen before. They looked her father in the eye, not like a janitor, but like a teacher. That night, back at home, Thomas sat at the kitchen table, still in his work boots. Elena placed a clean envelope beside him. He opened it. Inside was a note. Lab 4, A reserved seat title, Senior Systems Advisor. Role, Technical Consultant, The Whispering Engine Project. Signed, Professor James Hale. Thomas looked at her, his eyes full, not of pride, of peace. She said nothing, just sat beside him. And for the first time in years, they didn't talk about machines, they just sat, together, in a room that finally felt big enough for both of them. They didn't throw a ceremony. There was no ribbon, no spotlight, no applause, just an envelope, left quietly on Elena's desk. Inside was a note, handwritten on graph paper. You've earned more than a seat in my class. You've earned space. Use it well. JH attached was a small silver key. No tag, no instructions. Just a number engraved in steel. Lab 4, A. That afternoon, Elena walked alone to the far side of campus. It was quieter there, past the main halls, where echoes traveled slower, and the walls still smelled like old copper and chalk dust. She unlocked the door. Lab 4A clicked open. Inside, a workbench. 2 overhead lights, a whiteboard, and silence. The room wasn't new, but it was hers. She placed her notebook on the table, the same one that had followed her since the first day, edges torn, cover stained, heart full. She opened to a blank page, wrote slowly, carefully. Project, The Whispering Engine. Led, Elena Granger. Advisor, Thomas Granger. Purpose, to build systems that listen first, compute second. She underlined it, once, then leaned back, and for the first time, allowed herself to breathe. Outside, fall had begun to drift in. Boston wind sharper, leaves in the gutters. Students hurried past in coats and headphones. But inside Lab 4A, time had paused. Weeks later, posters began appearing in the hallway. A small flyer printed in black and white. Seminar open to all. Engineering by ear. What machines tell us before they break. Tuesdays, 6 p.m. Lab 4. A. Instructor, Elena Granger. Guest, T. Granger. Some scoffed, but more than a few came. At first, just out of curiosity. Then, out of awe. They weren't just learning how engines failed. They were learning how to listen. Dina came by once. She didn't say much, just stepped in, looked around, and ran a hand along the workbench. Before leaving, she turned and said, "It suits you," then paused. "And I'd like to contribute, if you'll have me." Elena nodded. No rivalry now, just two voices, finally speaking the same language. Professor Hale never visited Lab 4A, but he always walked past it slower than usual. Sometimes he'd stop and glance through the narrow window. If the lights were on, he'd smile, just faintly, as if some part of himself was still in there, still listening. At home, Thomas framed a photo, not of the turbine, not of the lab, but of Elena, standing at the whiteboard, surrounded by 3 students, explaining, without notes, how fluid dynamics can betray a machine before it fails. He placed it beside his toolbox, right next to the first wrench he ever gave her. One evening, Elena stayed late in the lab, alone. The turbine prototype was powered down. The air was still. She opened her notebook one last time, and on the back page, she wrote, "Not every student needs a perfect desk. Some only need a door, and someone willing to give them the key." She placed the key on the table, turned off the light, and walked into the hallway. Not away, but forward. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moment of this story. Maybe you were Elena once, or maybe you were her father. Or perhaps you were the quiet one in the back of the room, listening, always listening. If your heart ever stirred at the sound of a breathing machine, or at the wisdom of someone without a title, or at the hope in a child holding nothing but a key, then you're not just a viewer. You're part of this story. If you'd like to keep walking with us, through more quiet rooms, more unspoken lives, and more whispers worth hearing, please consider subscribing. Not for numbers, but for the kind of stories that still believe in listening.